So welcome to this session on sociolegal studies, research and activism in illiberal and authoritarian settings. My name's Melissa and we're based here at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia. For our panel today, we have two speakers with us and I'll introduce them both briefly. So Dr Maryam Khan is a sociolegal scholar and research fellow at the Institute of Development and Economic Alternatives in Pakistan. She has an SJD from the University of Wisconsin and an LLM from Yale. Her research interests relate to comparative constitutional law and history, judicialization and legal mobilization in authoritarian contexts, ethnic federalism and conflict, law and social movements, and women's struggles in Pakistan. She's published widely on these themes in international journals, and her current book project relates to her doctoral research on constitution making in Pakistan and involves a public history component on oral histories with constitution makers. And we also have with us Dr Visakesa Chandrasekaram, and he's an interdisciplinary researcher and practitioner working in areas of law, justice, human rights, and creative arts based at UNSW. In Sri Lanka, he worked as a human rights lawyer. He's also worked in the community legal sector in Australia, applying arts-based methods to deliver community legal education to culturally and linguistically diverse communities and people with disabilities. And he's also worked with several New South Wales government departments. In 2018, he joined the Faculty of Law at the University of Colombo, Sri Lanka, and in 2024, he was a creative fellow at Sydney Social Sciences and Humanities Advanced Research Centre and the ANU Humanities Research Centre. He's written several works of fiction and stage play scripts. He's directed 3 feature films, and we were fortunate to last night to watch the film essay Journey, which presented studies and stories of Sri Lanka's state-sponsored violence during conflict and post-conflict times, particularly as it related to women's experiences of sexual violence. So we have a wealth of expertise with us. So I might begin, Maryam, with you. And I wondered if you could tell us a bit about the Policy Institute that you're working at and how you came to that position in terms of your academic and research career and the kind of research you do there.
Thank you so much. Wonderful to be here. And I think I'm just going to speak in a kind of a stream of consciousness kind of thing, because there is no well-considered or thought out trajectory for the way in which I think most academics come into academic work in Pakistan. Not many institutional incentives to be part of the academy. So it's oftentimes a non-linear sort of organic pathway. And I think I can say the same for myself, because I originally trained as a barrister at Lincoln's Inn back in the early 2000s with the intention of becoming a legal practitioner. And I think very early on, within the first 2 years of practice, I decided to pivot from that because I realized that this is not going to be for me. And I quite serendipitously landed up at LUMS, which is the Lahore University of Management Sciences. It's one of the leading private research universities based out of Lahore. And at that time in 2005, LUMS was actually establishing its first sort of law program, which was still at that time a small department. And it was embedded within the social sciences. And the whole idea, I think, was in a sense inspired by the institutional landscape of legal education in India in the 90s, when you saw a mushrooming of these national law schools across India. But these were public institutions. In Pakistan, the LUMS model is what then was taken up by the public sector later on. So LUMS became this sort of pioneering institutional setting. And I really just found my way quite accidentally into LUMS. I was not really thinking about law teaching. I joined LUMS as a program developer which meant that I was heavily involved in the early stages of like curricular development, recruitment, policy formation within the law program itself. It was going to be a more policy-oriented program, more sort of social scientific pedagogies of law. So it was still very nascent and experimental. Um, and once I was there, I sort of then segued into law teaching as a teaching fellow. I, at that time, did not have a master's degree. So then, after about a 2-year period, I kind of hit a ceiling. So then I decided, well, now I need a graduate degree in law, which is then what motivated me to enter an LLM program at Yale. Um, and that was, I think, in my late 20s or early 30s. So I was one of the perhaps the older people in the LLM program. And then I came back. I came back to LUMS. I taught for about 4 or 5 years. And life just takes you in such a strange, sort of meandering ways, because once I had my daughter in 2012, I think, teaching became a huge chore for me. And I felt that this was just not for me. Once again, I needed to pivot from teaching responsibilities. What I really felt was my forte was going to be research. So, I mean, clearly it took me well over a decade to realize that I was at heart a researcher, and I wanted to be in an environment where I could do research with both sort of intellectual autonomy and without the pressures of like continuous sort of teaching responsibilities. So that's how I landed up in 2000 and I think 14 at Ideas, which is this local think tank. And interestingly, Ideas had just appeared on the scene in 2012. So you see like this series of serendipitous sort of things happening, pathways opening up as I'm walking on that journey. Which is a very uncertain, unpredictable sort of journey. And I have to say that at this time, 10 plus years at Ideas, I'm still again facing a crossroads because, of course, there's a huge crunch in terms of research grants and funding. Obviously, the avenues for generating revenues within a small think tank as opposed to a large sort of university, they've really shrunk. And so once again, there is a kind of uncertainty and precarity which is facing a lot of these smaller sort of research and policy institutes. So that's where I am right now. But the interesting thing is that, and this speaks to the kind of flexibility and fluidity that you find in institutional spaces in the global south, in places like Pakistan, where the academy is still very nascent, and particularly the legal academy. Which is to say that the policy institute that I'm working at, because of the human resource problem and the paucity of like rigorous, trained researchers, uh, ideas really just carved out a space for me for really kind of hardcore sort of academic kind of research and not policy. So I'm in a policy institute, but I have oftentimes trouble explaining to everyone, but I do academic research because policy is once again not my forte. I don't work with policymakers, but I understand um, uh, change in terms of influencing the narrative and sort of popular discourses, right? More sort of critical scholarship around things like constitutional politics, judicial reform, criminal justice related work, social movement work, and how that kind of connects with um, law and legal frameworks and legal reform. So those sorts of things, which you could arguably say are not necessarily divorced from the policy realm, but I work more in terms of, publishing critical pieces, which can then also maybe become um, reading material, if you will, or intellectual output for universities and law schools at large. So I'm going to stop here. And yeah. Anything else? Yeah, sure.
America, then Can you tell us a bit about what you understand to be sort of law and society studies? And I don't know if you want to speak in particular to the piece that you've written on sociolegal studies in Pakistan, just to give us a sense of like, I guess both how you approach it and how you see it in the context of Pakistan.
Yeah, great question. And a very thought-provoking one. And of course, I took almost a year to write this piece because it was a survey piece on socio-legal research in Pakistan, and had a lot of trouble thinking through, well, what does it mean? Where does it come from? A friend here yesterday used a term, socio-legal tradition, and that actually really provoked me to think about this. There is no tradition really of socio-legal work or research. It's still a very niche kind of an area. But I think that now the term is becoming a little more intelligible in the legal academy, because once again, I would say there is still a very small but a critical mass of legal or law and scholars based not just in Pakistan but outside of Pakistan now in global north institutions, where of course those sorts of conversations are happening, and so it's still a niche and a very sort of narrow kind of an area, but I think it is gaining ground, at least amongst law students who, let's say, go for their graduate studies abroad. So then it becomes something that is, much more accessible in terms of the meaning, the tradition, the historiography globally and across South Asia. So I think there is an increasing level of awareness and consciousness amongst legal scholars. There are so many now who are actually venturing out also for their PhDs and doctoral programs. And I think that really sort of adds to or amplifies the fact that there is this particular, subfield that exists within the law, which is, removed from our old sort of conventional ways of understanding law and studying law, which is very doctrinal. And I also have to say that we are at this point, at this juncture in Pakistan, where law, judges, processes of judicial appointments, legal reform, everything has really catapulted into the public imagination in a very sort of interesting way, because we have a burgeoning sort of media, both broadcast and social media, and then of course YouTubers and vloggers and all of that. So it's hard to like keep a lot of this critical talk, at least, or discourse out of the public domain. It sort of pervades now the political thinking. What did the judges do to invite this sort of backlash from the current military regime? Their wings have been clipped recently. There have been some really major constitutional amendments. There's a setting up of a federal constitutional court, all of that. And so that is inviting a lot of lay commentary on what the legal frameworks look like. This language of like coloniality and decoloniality is kind of seeping in, and that is not to say that people have an intellectual understanding of those terms, but just to say that I think it becomes easier for law and society and social legal scholars now to find a kind of a foothold into sort of avenues and forums where these things are being discussed with publics at large, right? So we have a lot of literary festivals every year in Lahore, at least, and in each one of them there's always a panel on constitutional politics. Interestingly, also the military power, hybrid regimes, these sorts of conversations are actually happening out in the open. Of course, you have intelligence officers sitting there and kind of policing what is being said and taking note. But these conversations are happening. So to that extent, the notion that law was this some kind of sacrosanct, autonomous sort of a vehicle for justice has really crumbled in a very major way, in a very ubiquitous kind of a manner, so that people are now talking about the influence of social facts and politics on law and judges. But it still kind of remains very narrow, right? So what you mean by socio-legal is still primarily focused on things like judicial politics, judicial behavior, the judiciary military nexus, and very little to do with like more, I mean, themes of marginalized groups, subaltern minorities. Those are things that are still yet to be kind of addressed through this lens.
Thank you. So I'll come now to Visa. And Visa, you're someone who's, again, had a non-linear career, shall we say, coming in and out of academia and a range of other sort of professions. So I just wondered if you want to reflect, now that you are in academia, how you see your position in terms of research, advocacy, and activism, and how, perhaps in particular, your films inform, well, how you use your research and your teaching to inform your films and so forth.
Thanks, Melissa, and thank you very much in inviting me here. And it's great to see you all. And I met some of you yesterday. Yeah, so very short answer is an outsider, and I think it just not really planned as such, because I like studying, I like researching. I ended up registering myself for a PhD at ANU. I think it must be 2008 or something, and at 2007 perhaps. Or six, and studying part-time at ANU while working for the railway department. And I was in the human resources unit doing some diversity and inclusion work. And the reason I wanted to study in that area is just because it was, it was related to my personal experience being a human rights lawyer in Sri Lanka, mainly defending political prisoners who were arrested under counterterrorism laws. So, and then, went around and worked for a number of other government departments as well, such as police and health. And so decided, well, I had enough in Australia now, so I should go back. And by the time I arrived in Colombo, there was a job advertisement for the law faculty, in Colombo University. So I thought, okay, now I have a PhD, and I managed to publish my monograph, and so and I might as well, give it a go. So yeah, they accepted me despite, yeah, there were a number of issues they have considered, including my sexual orientation and everything, but still they managed to, offer me the position. Now, I think for somebody like me, the issue is probably I'm placed in a bit of a unique and strange position, and I would never recommend anybody to take the path that I took, while I'm kind of sharing my experience. So it is about the transnationality. So being a dual citizen, dual national, having this dual allegiances to two different countries. I mean, both are my countries. Perhaps Sri Lanka is my first home and Australia is second home. And then having friends and families in both places, and having some interest in both places. So there is this kind of liminality in the academic existence as well. And also because things are very easy now these days, just to so I'll be sitting in a committee in happening in Colombo while I live here from my bedroom, and so that sort of things happen. Then somebody would invite me to just to kind of issue a press release, or being part of a interview, and all sort of these things happen. So this kind of dual existence is bit in a way challenging, and um, then why is it is happening? Because the island called Sri Lanka is very small, and it's brain drained. So a lot of people have left the country. So there are only few people, handful of people are left there, and also could take risk sometimes. Having said that, things are much different after the last election, but still people are getting used to the freedom, and perhaps those freedoms may not last for too long. And so because it is an island, you ended up doing so many things. So that's what happened to me. So it is a brain drain island. So okay, you think, okay, this film has never been made, so I have to make that film. Nobody has told that story, I have to tell that story. Or nobody has researched this in particular area, so I have to research. So I think that's what happened. So you are here in another different big island called Australia. Um, so many things have been done, so many things have been researched. And in fact, I can't really find an area that I should be researching. So that's kind of duality can be a bit challenging. I think the for me personally that I have these these competing priorities in my life. The one being paid by a university to continuously produce academic output, and then I, as an artist, I have the urge to express myself. So, and that is a very strong urge. So you can't keep postponing it. So sometimes you have to make certain compromises and somehow get your expression out there. And thirdly, this is the space. Um, there is a vacuum for activism, the political statements and the political activities. So, and then that vacuum has to be also filled. So whether you like it or not, you are being pushed to fill that vacuum because you are in that position to do that. Sometimes it could be the kangaroo, the emu in the passport, as opposed to the lion in the passport, because and that passport really helps you. And sometimes it is because you are the lawyer and you have the lawyers bar association identity card in Sri Lanka that's worth millions. So you can do so many things with that little ID card. And sometimes it is simply because being able to use number of different languages and articulate certain issues in a political, or legal context. So as I try to explain, it is, it's a mixed basket case in my case. So that's why I'm saying it is probably not something that everybody can do. And also it's very demanding if you have family and other commitments. So I think it is something only very few people perhaps should try to do.
Thank you. And yes, the idea of wearing many hats does sound quite exhausting, but also the constant sort of pioneering in some sense that you're doing, whether that's in your research or in your filmmaking or other endeavors. So I wonder if you could tell us a bit about your book, because I haven't heard you talk about it in other forums. So your book is called An Interdisciplinary Study of the Use of Confessional Evidence in Sri Lanka. And if I'm not mistaken, it has recently been reissued, am I right? Or it was back in, you initially published in 2017, is that right? Yeah.
I think it's only electronic copies being issued.
Okay, but I should say, I saw a 2025 paperback version online, so it appeared to be reissued. So I don't know. Okay, there you go. Maybe you didn't know. So I wonder if you could tell us a bit about the main ideas behind the book, but in particular the approach you took. So we're talking here, sort of in the context of sociolegal studies. Would you characterize it as sociolegal research? And if so, why? Or if not, why not?
Thank you. Look, when it comes to articulating the context of social legal research, perhaps I'm not very good at that, but I can what I feel is it is very much about it is an interdisciplinary research, and there are a lot of um, um, the interfaces you can see in terms of the approach taken. So it is not strictly a legal approach that I took. So again, it goes back to the three kind of competing interests I mentioned earlier. So what I originally proposed to Australian National University was a research on the use of confession as evidence under the counterterrorism laws, and then a fiction, um, kind of a fictional piece that is going to actually reach that is going to be targeted at the general audience, lay audience, not academic audience, and then also my kind of personal urge to be in the activist and reveal all the secrets the government is hiding. So and that's how the whole project was articulated. I thought, okay, if I do this research, perhaps first time people will realize all those thousands of political detainees, political prisoners who are in the prison system are not real terrorists. They are, in fact, poor innocent people who just don't have the money to pay the lawyers and who don't have the money to pay the ransom and so forth. So that's how it came about. And then the research became too big, so the fiction was separated, and fiction was no longer part of the PhD, and it was published separately. The fiction was called Tigers Don't Confess, and in the research, actually. So I was, as I said, I was working for the railway, so I was not in this university kind of environment. So just doing a lot of things by myself and exploring by myself. But it was so I was looking at couple of different disciplinary platforms to discuss certain issues in terms of the research questions. So one is about the ethnic studies. So the whole issue about ethnicity and minority, how it is going to how it has an implication in terms of the enforcement of counterterrorism laws. So it is being used against minority racial groups. So it's just kind of a weapon of suppressing claims of self-determination. And then also I just bumped into forensic linguistics. So I just ended up developing this tool to analyze the statements recorded by the police. So you do these you follow these steps and just kind of make an assessment whether these statements are actually real or fake. And those days it was easy. Now the police is much better, and so they can fake I mean, they can do better reports, statements. And thirdly, I also looked at the point of terrorism, and the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka were very different from its, I mean, in many ways, the ideologies were different from the Islamic terrorist. And the Tamil Tigers existed for a very long time, and their kind of idea of secularity and idea of martyrdom and how that actually would have some sort of the relational aspect to this idea of confession. So do the tigers confess? Would they end up confessing? If they have the capacity to blow themselves up by, carrying suicide bombs, or have the capacity to commit suicide wearing the cyanide capsules, the moment that they captured, they are supposed to bite the capsule and commit suicide. So if that is the if that is the scenario on the other end, how can you really expect these so-called confessions to be truthful? And so you can't even capture them. So how are you going to get a confession from them? So that's sort of not one, not two, couple of hundreds, and sometimes thousands. So that's kind of the way that I actually articulated the multidisciplinary, rather than articulating, set up the multidisciplinary platform. So it actually helped tackling the problem from a number of different perspectives.
Thank you. So, Mariam, I know that you also sort of work into across disciplines. So, if we sort of characterize sociolegal studies as one of its hallmarks being interdisciplinarity. So, we had a conversation yesterday around comparative constitutional law and law and society studies, and that these are both areas that you work in. And I wondered if you wanted to reflect on how you work across those two sort of fields, and whether it's possible to bring them together, or what are the tensions when you try to do so.
Thank you so much. So it's interesting how now we sort of take for granted the fact that socio-legal studies is an interdisciplinary field. And I think initially it probably wasn't envisaged as such, right? So in terms of the pioneering work that was done in law and society, yes, of course, the social had a huge impact on that field. But there was this orientation trying to kind of explore the gap between the law and the books and the law and action. So it was about kind of trying to understand that gap. Why was it that there was so much of a disconnect between what the law said or what it intended the outcome to be and what actually happened? And this was like the gap studies era, in the 60s and 70s in the US Academy. And this sort of framing was also picked up in India and then, in Pakistan, certainly. Much of the earlier work that can be identified as socio-legal, in fact, is coming mostly from area studies and political science folks who are also, in a sense, adopting this idea of the gap. But I think slowly and steadily, the field has evolved into this understanding that it's just broadly an umbrella term now to understand how law can be studied through a very interdisciplinary lens, and that means opening it up to the whole sort of length and breadth of social sciences and humanities, right? Um, and so, I mean, I've discussed this in the work that I did when I was mapping socio-legal research in Pakistan. But I think clearly when I started studying the Constitution, constitutional history, constitution making, I felt that once again, I was looking at the Constitution through a very sort of specific template of comparative constitutional law that required me, A, to privilege the text, not so much the impact, say perhaps a little bit about the context. So just very sort of a minimal contextualization, but then to kind of speak in terms of like best practices, the kinds of uh, design sort of elements that went into making either a good constitution or a good sort of constitutional process that kind of would ensure the longevity or endurance of constitutions or legal frameworks, all of that. And so that made me sort of question the relevance of that field to Pakistan and South Asia broadly, because I realized that the constitutional text really has very little meaning. You have to look at the historical trajectories of constitutional meaning in a way that may be completely sort of at odds with what the textual interpretation on the face of the constitution would be. And so that's where I think I really in earnest began to undertake this exploration when I joined my SJD program in Madison, Wisconsin. That was back in 2018. And I had been in touch loosely with law and society people like Mark Galanta, who has just recently passed at Wisconsin. But then when I started my SJD, I came in contact with a number of law and society scholars who were also constitutional scholars, but in the socio-legal or law and society tradition. And that to me was such a revelation, right? And I realized that, oh, there is already this sort of synergy or intersection which is really possible. And it's possible to understand constitutions in their sort of social, economic, and political context. But that would be an uphill struggle for global South scholars, primarily because first they would have to have a framework for justifying that pivot from the usual understanding of how comparative constitutional law is done. And apologies if I'm sort of oversimplifying what comparative constitutional law looks like, but the dominant sort of strands kind of tend to push some of our constitutional contexts into frameworks that are totally unrecognizable for people who are actually living there and observing things as they happen. And so I think that was a huge turning point. And so in my own work in constitutional history and constitution making, I've taken a socio-legal approach. I was absolutely clueless about what that meant when I first started talking about it, but I think I have made perhaps some headway in trying to understand. So, for instance, my work on constitution making is less to do with how the constitution is drafted or how the formal constitutional design of the constituent assembly impacts the constitution itself or its formal sort of textual design. So I sort of quite intentionally put those questions aside and reformulated these questions in terms of why does constitution making happen in the first place? What are those larger social, historical, and in my context, post-colonial trajectories and transformations that bring about this need for a new, let's say, constitutional charter or settlement? What are the forces, particularly the social demands that connect then with political movements for constitution making? And so I think I've taken what is a distinctly sort of, in a sense, bottom up approach to constitution making, which is to say, what relationship would a constitution have to people at large or publics at large? And so clearly there is an interpenetration between the social and the political, which was not being captured, I felt, in the existing works in Pakistan until recently, even in India. Which has a longer historiography on constitution making. So and that just means having to really pluralize and diversify the sources that you're looking at. So you can't possibly just be looking at textual or documentary archives. Then you have to go beyond that, which then necessitated things like oral history interviews. And I've been lucky enough because this sort of goes back about 50 years. So I still have a number of people that I can speak to, and not just those sitting in the assembly, but also people in the bureaucracy at that time, journalists who were reporting on constitution making, student leaders, student union leaders, trade union leaders who were observing this and actually putting forward their own sort of demands on the constitutional process itself. So that is essentially how I tried to create synergies, and I think it was the most experimental sort of thing that I've ever done, but I think it has a huge scope in order for ordinary people to take an interest in constitutions, quite apart from the very sort of politically polarizing and divisive role that it plays. Do you want me to go further? Yeah. So just one more minute. So I just wanted to also highlight something which is very dear to me, which is that in this process, as I was reading the debates, and constitutional debates in the Constituent Assembly are something that I intentionally sort of displace in my own work because I feel like, okay, that is a formal component, but that's not the centerpiece of this whole process. But even so, as I was going through those debates, I realized that there were 6 women sitting in that assembly in 1972-73. And that to me was shocking. Nobody's ever spoken about those 6 women. Even the feminist histories in Pakistan don't talk about those 6 women. And I was just shocked. It was as if the 70s had been entirely erased from public imagination. And all we have is like sort of myth making now, and very partisan and divisive pro and con, sort of pro and anti sort of narratives insofar as that particular government was concerned. And so then I went down this rabbit hole of identifying, contacting, and interviewing second generation narrators for those 6 women, which involves close family relatives, children, close sort of colleagues who are very senior now. And it just led me down this path, which has been so rewarding, but it's been completely like a shot in the dark for me. And I'm creating this archive. There's a larger oral history archive on constitution making, but then there's like this very special subcategory of women constitution makers, and I'm currently working on that. So I think possibly another example of socio-legal work in terms of constitutional process, thinking about maybe, it could be a constitutions and gender type of an interdisciplinary sort of focus. So yeah, I'm going to stop there, but I could just carry on.
Yes, there's certainly a lot we could talk about. And what I liked is your reference to sort of experimentalism. And I think many of us can affiliate with that idea that our work does feel quite experimental and is often, as Visa mentioned before, filling not just filling gaps in a kind of ordinary sense, but really pioneering in areas where there hasn't been research before, or trying methods that perhaps are outside the box of either what we were trained to think of, or that simply are less common, particularly in law schools. So we'll come to some question time in a moment, but would you join me in thanking our speakers, first of all, for sharing their experience? So we had the Visa's film yesterday, and we've also